Searchers is a movie that grows on you. It did on me. Every time I watch.
Where were you in the summer of 1956, when John Ford's The Searchers got into theaters? Maybe you were not born yet, and only caught it years later on a late-night television broadcast. Maybe you stumbled on it in a college film class, where professors insisted it was the greatest Western ever filmed. Or perhaps you heard its influence in unexpected places, from George Lucas borrowing its imagery for Star Wars, to Martin Scorsese calling it one of the deepest films about obsession ever made. When The Searchers premiered, audiences thought they were walking into another John Wayne cowboy picture, full of noble gestures and clean victories. What they got was something different. Ford's movie carried shadows. Wayne's Ethan Edwards was not a simple hero. He was bitter, haunted, and at times frightening. The story was less about triumph and more about the cost of hatred. Viewers left the theater unsettled, and critics did not know how to classify it. Was it just another Western or something stranger? Something that would stay with you long after the credits rolled? Over time, the film grew in stature and reputation. Directors from Steven Spielberg to David Lean praised it. Scholars pored over its frames, and the final image of John Wayne walking into the wilderness became one of the most studied shots in cinema. Yet, for all its recognition, much about The Searchers remains surprising. From the casting choices that almost never happened, to the Navajo extras who turned filming into their own inside joke, to Ford's obsession with Monument Valley that nearly broke his crew, the movie hides a series of weird stories you may have never heard.
I find The Searchers to be particularly...
From novel to screen, Ford's unlikely source and fast rise. Every great Western starts with a story, but The Searchers had an unusual beginning. Its roots lay in Alan LeMay's 1954 novel of the same name, a book inspired by grim history. LeMay had studied frontier accounts of kidnappings and raids, particularly the real story of Cynthia Ann Parker, a young girl taken by Comanche in Texas and later recaptured after years of living with them. He reshaped those fragments of history into a tale about two men who set out to bring a kidnapped girl home. John Ford was not a stranger to Westerns, but when he came across LeMay's novel, something about its darkness caught his attention. Unlike the simpler tales of lawmen and outlaws that had dominated the genre, this was a story where the central figure was not a pure hero at all. Ethan Edwards was bitter, angry, and possibly even too broken to be redeemed. Ford knew that if he put John Wayne in that role, audiences would be forced to see Wayne in a new light. In a later interview, film historian Joseph McBride noted, Ford had spent years shaping the Western into a kind of American myth, but with The Searchers, he wanted to tear into that myth. He wanted to show the cracks, the ugliness, and the obsession underneath. The move from page to screen was surprisingly fast. In those days, Hollywood often took years to buy rights, assign writers, and push a story forward. But Ford had influence. He was already a 4-time Oscar winner, and when he told Warner Brothers he wanted The Searchers, the project leapt to the front of the line. Within less than 2 years of the book's publication, cameras were capturing scenes in Monument Valley. That kind of turnaround was rare, and it showed how determined Ford was to make this story before it cooled. The screenplay was handled by Frank S. Nugent, who had worked with Ford before on Fort Apache and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. Nugent stripped away parts of LeMay's novel but sharpened its themes of obsession and prejudice. In the book, the search spanned 5 years. In the film, the years pass almost silently, giving the audience the sense of endless time without slowing the pace of the story. Nugent and Ford also carved out more space for Martin, the adopted nephew, so that another voice could balance Ethan's darkness. Alan LeMay himself was not well known to audiences. He had been a journeyman writer for magazines like Collier's and had written pulp adventures long before the novel. In a rare radio interview from 1955, he admitted he was stunned that Ford wanted his book. "I thought it might sell a few copies in the West, maybe make a little noise in the book clubs," LeMay said with a laugh. "I never thought it would turn into a picture, let alone with Ford and Wayne." For John Wayne, the project was a turning point. Years later, in a conversation with journalist Maurice Zolotow, Wayne said, "When Ford brought me The Searchers, I knew it wasn't going to be like the other pictures. Ethan wasn't a clean-cut fella. He was mean, prejudiced, and you couldn't always like him. That scared me, but it also made me want to play him." By the time the movie premiered in May of 1956, the novel had already been eclipsed by the film. Many viewers never even realized it was based on a book at all. Critics of the time mentioned LeMay's name only in passing, if at all. The movie had swallowed the novel whole, and in doing so, it transformed a mid-list Western paperback into the foundation of what many scholars now call the most important Western ever made. That speed from an obscure book to a John Ford epic within 2 years gave the project an urgency, as though it had been waiting for the right pair of hands. And in Ford's hands, the story of Ethan Edwards stopped being just a Western. It became a myth, one that carried the weight of America's history, its violence, and its uneasy conscience. Monument Valley and the look of the film. When people think of The Searchers, the first images that come to mind are not always of John Wayne or Natalie Wood, but of the landscape. Monument Valley, with its towering red cliffs and endless desert floor, became as much a character in the film as Ethan Edwards himself. John Ford had filmed there before, but with The Searchers, he turned the valley into something more than a backdrop. It was mood, it was memory, and it was myth. Ford had first discovered Monument Valley in the late 1930s when he shot Stagecoach. The Navajo Nation controlled the land, and by the 1950s, Ford had built a close working relationship with many of the local families. For The Searchers, he returned to the valley for weeks at a time, dragging his crew and stars far away from the comfort of Hollywood sets.
John Ford fell in love with Monument Valley in the late 1930s.
Cinematographer Winton C. Hawk remembered the challenge of shooting there. In a rare interview, Hawk recalled, "Ford always said, 'Point the camera at God's work and don't mess it up.' But that was easier said than done. The light in Monument Valley changes by the minute. One shot might be golden and 5 minutes later the clouds would roll in and it would all be flat. We had to move fast and trust Ford's instincts. Those instincts were legendary. Ford was not one to storyboard or explain every shot to his crew. Instead, he would suddenly bark an order, move the camera, ride the horses through, wait for the shadow to fall just so. The crew sometimes grumbled, but the results were undeniable. The sweeping vistas, with riders cutting across the horizon, became some of the most iconic images in cinema. The valley, however, was merciless. Daytime heat soared past 100 degrees, while nights dropped to near freezing. Equipment broke down constantly and the cast sweltered in their heavy period costumes. One assistant recalled John Wayne pouring sand out of his boots after a long day, muttering, "Hell, I'm carrying half the desert home." Yet Ford embraced those hardships. He believed the rugged environment gave his actors an authenticity they could not fake on a soundstage. The dust in their hair, the squint in their eyes, even the exhaustion in their posture all fed into the realism of the film. For the Navajo people who lived nearby, Ford's return was both a source of work and of humor. Hundreds of Navajo extras were hired to play Comanche warriors, and they often camped near the set with their families. Because Ford rarely translated their dialogue for English-speaking audiences, some of the extras slipped in jokes or personal remarks. Film historian Harry Carey Jr., who acted in several Ford films, later said, "If you spoke Navajo, The Searchers was a comedy in places. The warriors were teasing each other, calling out funny names, even making jokes about John Wayne." But Ford never stopped them. He liked the sound, and he knew most audiences would never know the difference. Visually, Monument Valley gave the story a sense of isolation that no studio set could achieve. Ethan Edwards was always framed against endless horizons, as if to remind the audience that his anger and his quest were tiny compared to the land itself. Ford was famous for his use of doorways and frames, and here he doubled down on the technique. The film begins with a door opening to reveal the valley, and it ends with a door closing on Ethan, leaving him outside. That visual motif would be studied for decades in film schools, but at the time it was simply Ford's way of saying that Ethan belonged to the wilderness, not the home. In later years, filmmakers lined up to praise Ford's use of the valley. George Lucas admitted that his framing of Luke Skywalker looking out at Tatooine's twin suns was inspired by Ford's long horizon shots. Martin Scorsese once said, "You look at The Searchers and you understand space in movies differently." Ford used Monument Valley the way painters use a canvas to stretch human figures against something bigger than themselves. By the end of filming, the cast and crew were battered by the weather but awed by the footage. Ford had turned the valley into an actor, one whose presence was as unforgettable as John Wayne's performance. Monument Valley was no longer just a location. It was a myth etched into the American imagination. Casting and character challenges.
He managed to get something from his characters.
For most audiences in the 1950s, going to a John Wayne movie meant seeing the Duke as a straightforward hero. He was the man who stood tall, fought the bad guys, and rode into the sunset with honor. But the Searchers turned that idea upside down. Ethan Edwards was not a simple hero. He was a man of war scars, full of prejudice, and willing to kill rather than forgive. That casting choice alone shocked audiences. But the full story of how the cast came together reveals even more behind-the-scenes stories. John Ford and John Wayne had worked together for decades. Ford liked to push Wayne in directions that challenged him, and The Searchers was his boldest attempt yet. In an interview many years later, Wayne admitted, "Ethan was the hardest part I ever played." Ford said, "You've been too clean too long, people trust you too much. Let's see if they can still trust you after this." Wayne threw himself into the role, wearing his Confederate coat like a second skin and building Ethan's stiff walk to suggest a man always on guard. But Wayne was not the only complex figure in the film. Natalie Wood, who was only 17 at the time, was cast as Debbie, the kidnapped niece Ethan spends years searching for. Warner Brothers had initially hesitated to put her in the role. Executives thought she was too glamorous and too recognizable from films like Rebel Without a Cause. According to film historian Scott Amon, Ford fought to keep her. He believed that having a well-known young actress play Debbie would make Ethan's obsession feel even more potent because audiences would recognize her innocence. Natalie Wood herself later described the experience as unsettling. In a 1970 interview, she said, "I was still very young and Ford was tough on me. He wanted Debbie to be more of a symbol than a person. I remember feeling like I wasn't allowed to smile much or show softness. It was as if he wanted me to carry all the weight of Ethan's hatred just by being there." Jeffrey Hunter, who played Martin Pauly, Ethan's adopted nephew, was cast partly to balance Wayne's intensity. Martin was young, not sure of himself, but morally clear. His presence gave the audience someone to root for when Ethan's actions became too harsh. Hunter recalled Ford's approach on set. "He never told me directly what to do. He would insult me until I found the right emotion. If I looked too polished, he would say, 'You're not a movie star. You're a boy trying to find his way. Play it that way.' It was brutal, but it worked." The supporting cast also carried Ford's signature touch of using familiar faces. Vera Miles played Lori, Martin's love interest, adding humor and warmth to a story otherwise drenched in anger. Ward Bond, one of Ford's favorite actors, appeared as Reverend Captain Samuel Clayton, a character who embodied both spiritual authority and frontier toughness. Ford even slipped family members into the mix. His son-in-law Ken Curtis had a role, and his brother Patrick Wayne appeared in uniform. This was typical Ford, blending professional actors with his own circle of friends and family, making the set feel like a gathering even as he drove them hard. But perhaps the most unpredictable story of the casting was how Ford directed Wayne himself. Ethan Edwards was not written as a likable man, yet Wayne's natural charisma kept audiences tethered to him. Ford seemed to relish the contradiction. According to co-star Harry Carey Jr., Ford told Wayne, "I want them to hate you in one scene and pray for you in the next. Don't ever give them comfort." That directive made Ethan one of the most complex figures Wayne ever played, and it left audiences divided. Critics at the time were not sure what to make of it. The New York Times review noted that Wayne's Ethan was a curious mixture of nobility and cruelty, both admirable and repellent. For the 1950s, when heroes were expected to be clean-cut and flawless, this was a shocking description. Decades later, directors who grew up watching the film saw the casting as revolutionary. Steven Spielberg once said, "Without Ethan Edwards, there's no Travis Bickle, there's no Michael Corleone." He was the first real anti-hero on the screen on that scale. Martin Scorsese echoed that view, calling Ethan's final decision to spare Debbie one of the most emotional moments in American film. So while audiences thought they were stepping into another John Wayne adventure, Ford and his cast had other plans. Natalie Wood became the face of innocence. Jeffrey Hunter, the voice of moral clarity, and Wayne, the embodiment of obsession. Together, they built a story that was less about winning or losing and more about the dangerous cracks inside the American frontier hero. On set, local extras, and harsh conditions. When audiences look at The Searchers today, they see the sweeping shots of Monument Valley, the dusty marches across open plains, and the endless chases under the burning sun. What they rarely think about is how punishing those scenes were to shoot. Behind the camera, John Ford demanded realism, and that meant pushing his cast and crew through grueling days in the desert. The most obvious challenge was the climate. Monument Valley in the summer could climb well above 100 degrees by midday, and in the winter, the same land dropped into biting cold with high winds whipping across the mesas. Crew member Frank Nugent once recalled, "There was no mercy in that place. By noon, the rocks were so hot you couldn't sit on them, and at night you froze inside your bedroll." That environment became the backdrop for nearly every scene, making the harshness of the land feel real because it was real.
The scenery doesn't overwhelm the movie.
Ford, famously stubborn, refused to pamper his actors. When Vera Miles complained that her costume was too heavy in the blazing heat, Ford reportedly barked, "The frontier didn't come with air conditioning. Wear it." John Wayne did not complain, but he admitted later that the desert drained him faster than any other set he had worked on. In a 1960 interview, he said, "You'd go home at night and feel like the desert had sucked the marrow out of you." Ford wanted that look on our faces, so he let the desert do the work. Beyond the main cast, the extras who filled out the Comanche tribes and frontier families faced their own hardships. Ford often recruited Navajo locals from nearby reservations to play Comanche warriors. These extras were paid minimally, often less than $10 a day, and spent long hours on horseback under the punishing sun. Still, many of them remembered the experience fondly, if only because Ford insisted on involving them in multiple films. Actor and Navajo consultant Jay Silverheels once remarked, "Ford was tough, but he gave a lot of our people steady work. He didn't always get the culture right, but he made sure we were in the frame." There was, however, constant tension over how Native extras were treated. Some recalled being given leftover military uniforms or recycled costumes to wear, regardless of accuracy. Others pointed out that Ford insisted on portraying Comanches as the antagonists, which meant many Navajo extras were filmed charging into battle scenes that painted them as the enemy. Historian Angela Ailey later noted, "The casting reinforced stereotypes, but for the Navajo, it was employment in a region with little opportunity." That contradiction defined the production. The physical risks on set were also very real. Horses bucked and stumbled on the rocky terrain, and at least 2 extras were injured during staged battle charges. Stuntman Chuck Robertson, who doubled for Wayne, remembered a particular sequence where he was dragged across the ground to simulate being pulled by a horse. He later said, "Ford didn't care if you scraped up half your back. He cared if it looked good on film." Robertson walked away with bruises and scars, but the shot made it into the final cut. Ford's treatment of his cast was another legendary part of the production. He believed in breaking actors down so they would give raw, unguarded performances. Ward Bond once joked, "If Ford wasn't cussing you out, you weren't doing your job." Vera Miles echoed that sentiment less fondly, saying, "You never forgot the way he glared at you. It was like he could see every weakness." Yet even she admitted that under the dust and exhaustion, Ford drew performances no one else could have. For John Wayne, the harsh conditions helped him disappear into Ethan Edwards. His sunburned face, his stiff gait, and the weary way he carried himself were not just acting. They were the real toll of long days in the desert. When a journalist later asked how much of Ethan's world weariness came from performance, Wayne smiled and said, "Go stand in Monument Valley for a week, and then ask me again." Perhaps the strangest twist of all was how Ford treated the Navajo extras at the end of filming. Local legend has it that he often paid part of their wages in sheep, a practice that baffled outsiders but made sense in the community where livestock was still more useful than cash. Harry Carey Jr. confirmed the story, saying, "One day you'd see the Navajo men on horseback in full war paint. The next day they were herding sheep Ford had given them as pay." That was Ford, always practical, never predictable. The result of all this effort was a film where the landscape feels like a character itself. The dust, the sweat, the unforgiving sun, they are not just backdrops, they are forces that shape the story. Every squint, every limp, every layer of dirt on the actors' faces came from real hardship. For Ford, that was the only way to tell the story of men and women surviving on the edge of civilization. As film critic Roger Ebert later wrote, "Watching The Searchers, you can feel the heat, you can taste the dust. That wasn't movie magic. That was Ford dragging his cast into the desert and refusing to let them escape." Themes of race and controversy.
He's filled with, he just literally acts out the racism.
When The Searchers first hit theaters in May of 1956, many audience members thought they were peeping into another John Wayne Western, full of chases, duels, and rugged frontier life. What they got instead was a film that unsettled them. Beneath the grand landscapes and thrilling shootouts lay a story centered on hatred, cultural fear, and obsession. It was this unflinching approach to race that gave the movie its power and its controversy. At the center of the storm was Ethan Edwards. Unlike the noble cowboys Wayne had played in earlier films, Ethan was openly hostile toward Native Americans. He used racial slurs without hesitation, and his quest to recover his niece Debbie was complicated by his willingness to kill her if she had been tainted by living among Comanches. For 1956, this was shocking material. Critics were unsure if Ford and Wayne were exposing prejudice or reinforcing it. Film historian Glenn Frankel, who studied the production in depth, described Ethan as a man whose racism defines him, but also a character Ford allows us to study without easy answers. That ambiguity was deliberate. In interviews years later, John Ford admitted he wanted Ethan to embody the darkest parts of the frontier spirit. He reportedly told screenwriter Frank Nugent, "The frontier was built on hate as much as it was on courage. Don't clean that up." Yet the treatment of Native Americans in the film was far from progressive. Navajo extras essentially played Comanche characters, and they were given little voice beyond battle cries or menacing gestures. Chief Scar, the film's antagonist, was portrayed by German-American actor Henry Brandon, who wore heavy makeup to approximate a native look. Brandon himself later reflected, "It was a different time. We weren't thinking about authenticity. Ford wanted menace, so that's what I gave him." For many Native viewers, this casting and characterization stung. Scholar Angela Alis noted, "The Searchers reinforced stereotypes of Native Americans as brutal and savage, with little humanity. At the same time, Ford gave Ethan such extreme prejudice that the audience was forced to see the cost of such thinking. That tension is what makes the film endure, but it also makes it problematic." Natalie Wood, who played Debbie, remembered feeling conflicted about the storyline. In a 1970 interview, she said, "As a young actress, I didn't think much about it then, but later I realized how much of the film was about fear of assimilation, about someone changing because they lived among a different people. That theme runs very deep and it is very uncomfortable." John Wayne himself defended the portrayal at the time. He argued that Ethan was not meant to be admired but studied. In a late interview, Wayne explained, "People always thought I was the hero in those pictures. Ethan wasn't a hero. He was a man who hated so much that he almost killed the thing he loved most. That's not a hero. That's a tragedy." Even so, Wayne's personal views on race, which were often controversial, made it difficult for later generations to separate the character from the actor. The public reaction in 1956 was divided. Some critics praised Ford's bravery for presenting a deeply flawed hero, while others accused him of glorifying prejudice. The Los Angeles Times called Ethan a bitter man whose hatred drives the story forward, a departure from the shining knights of earlier westerns. Yet Native activists in later decades criticized the film for perpetuating negative images of indigenous people, noting that Ford's choice to use Navajo actors without giving them authentic dialogue only reinforced stereotypes. Over time, however, filmmakers began to see The Searchers not as a simple Western, but as a psychological study. Martin Scorsese described it as a story about racism eating a man alive until he has nothing left. Steven Spielberg added, "It's about the darkness that built America. The grandeur of the land, yes, but also the hatred under the surface."
He's a poet, too. He's a poet of hatred, and he just shows us the worst.
One of the most controversial moments in the film remains Ethan's final confrontation with Debbie. After years of hunting her, he raises his arms as if to kill her, but instead lifts her up and says, "Let's go home, Debbie." That shift, coming after 2 hours of venom and violence, left audiences stunned. Ford never explained Ethan's change of heart. Some saw it as redemption, others as weakness, and many as a reflection of America's struggle to reconcile its past. Harry Carey Jr., who was on set for the scene, remembered Ford's instructions clearly. He told Duke, "Don't play it soft, play it like it hurts." And that's what you see, a man so full of hate he doesn't know what to do with mercy when it finally arrives.
So in a sense, what he's doing, he hates so much that he hates beyond the grave.
O'Day, the debate continues. Some critics argue that the film is racist by its very construction, portraying Native Americans as little more than a threat. Others believe Ford intentionally exposed prejudice to hold up a mirror to American society. Both may be true. The complexity is what has kept The Searchers alive in classrooms, film studies, and late-night debates. What cannot be denied is that The Searchers forced audiences to see John Wayne in a way they never had before, and it cracked open conversations about race in American film that continue to this day. Whether Ford intended to critique or simply reflect the biases of his era, he created a story that still unsettles and provokes. As critic Pauline Kael once summed it up, The Searchers is both poisoned and profound. It hates and it makes us confront hate. That is why it remains unforgettable. Legacy and lasting influence. When The Searchers was released in 1956, it earned decent box office numbers but was not considered a groundbreaking success. Critics praised the cinematography, questioned the darkness of John Wayne's character, and then moved on. Few could have predicted that this film, more than 60 years later, would be hailed as one of the greatest works in American cinema. Its legacy did not explode overnight. It grew slowly, like a seed planted in Monument Valley's red soil, waiting for future generations to fully understand its depth. For John Wayne, the film represented his most complex role. Though audiences in the 1950s admired him as a rugged hero, Wayne himself later admitted that Ethan Edwards remained the role that challenged him the most. In a rare moment of reflection, he told an interviewer in the late 1960s, "I was never sure if people understood Ethan. Some thought he was the good guy. He wasn't. He was the toughest part I ever played because he was a man eaten alive by hate." That complexity separated Ethan from the clean-cut cowboys Wayne was known for, and it paved the way for the anti-hero archetype in film. Directors who came of age in the 1960s and 70s saw The Searchers not just as a Western, but as a model for psychological storytelling. Martin Scorsese frequently cited the movie as an influence on Taxi Driver, with Travis Bickle echoing Ethan's obsession and isolation. In interviews, Scorsese explained, "Ethan is a man driven by demons, and that's what I tried to capture in Travis. The search isn't just for Debbie, it's for his own soul." Steven Spielberg also credited the film as a blueprint. Going so far as to recreate the famous doorway shot in E.T., Spielberg remarked, "That shot of Ethan standing in the doorway, framed by the house and the desert, it's one of the greatest images ever put on film. It says everything about being inside and outside, belonging and not belonging." Even George Lucas acknowledged the film's influence on Star Wars. He admitted that the plot of Luke Skywalker returning to find his family's homestead destroyed by stormtroopers was directly inspired by Ethan's discovery of his brother's burned ranch. Lucas said, "When I was a kid, The Searchers was burned into my brain. I wanted to make my own space version of that story, the lone hero searching, scarred by loss." Film scholars continued to rediscover the movie in the decades that followed. In 1989, the Library of Congress selected The Searchers for preservation in the National Film Registry, citing its cultural, historical, and aesthetic significance. By the early 2000s, it routinely appeared near the top of greatest films ever made lists, cementing its place not only as a Western classic, but as a cornerstone of American cinema. Actors from the film also reflected on its lasting power. Vera Miles admitted years later that she had not fully grasped the story's weight while filming. She said, "At the time, I just thought it was another Western. Looking back, I see what Ford was doing. He was tearing apart the myths we all grew up with." Jeffrey Hunter, before his death in 1969, spoke fondly of working on the project, saying, "I didn't realize it then, but I was part of something that would outlive all of us." The visual language of The Searchers also shaped how audiences understood the West. Monument Valley, already iconic from earlier Ford films, became immortalized as the cinematic symbol of the American frontier. The film's use of wide shots, framing characters as small figures dwarfed by endless desert, influenced not only westerns, but also epics in every genre. And then there is that doorway shot, Ethan standing in silhouette watching Debbie embraced by her family, before turning and walking alone into the desert. It is the most famous closing image in film history. Ford did not explain it, but scholars have read it as the ultimate statement on Ethan's place in the world. He is a man who can find Debbie but cannot join her. He is the outsider, the relic of a violent past, condemned to wander forever. Even audiences today feel the sting of that ending. In a 2011 documentary, film critic Peter Bogdanovich said, "That shot breaks your heart every time. Ethan saved her, but he can't save himself. That's why the film stays with you, because it doesn't give you peace." The influence of The Searchers has stretched far beyond the Western genre. Its DNA can be found in war films, crime dramas, and science fiction. Its themes of obsession, prejudice, and redemption continue to resonate, and its visual style remains a model for directors worldwide. Ultimately, the film's legacy lies in its contradictions. It is both admired and criticized, celebrated and condemned. It is a Western that both embraces and dismantles the myths of the American frontier. And it is a film that gave John Wayne his darkest, most unforgettable role. As John Ford himself once said, when asked late in life if The Searchers was his most excellent film, "I don't know, but it was the one that told the truth, even if people didn't want to hear it." And that is why The Searchers endures. It is not a simple adventure. It is a mirror, one that reflects the beauty of the land, the weight of hatred, and the cost of obsession. Its influence echoes in the work of every director who came after, and its questions linger long after the credits roll. Nearly 70 years after its release, The Searchers continues to stir debate, inspire directors, and unsettle audiences. John Wayne's Ethan Edwards remains one of cinema's most complex figures, a man defined by obsession and scarred by hate. John Ford's harsh methods, the cast's struggles, and the film's controversial portrayal of race all shaped a story that refuses to fade. From Monument Valley's blistering heat to the unforgettable doorway shot, every frame carries weight. And that is why The Searchers endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a haunting reminder of the questions America still wrestles with. Which of these behind-the-scenes facts do you love most about the movie? Let's hear from you in the comments. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to your channel and enable your notifications for subsequent videos.